welcome everybody. This is Casey Wallace, and this is another great episode of Extraordinary Experiences. And today our guest is Matthew Forrest. He is this really, really interesting guy, global traveler and entrepreneur in everything that he does. And Matthew is one of those, Julius refers to people like Matthew that has what they call a quad phonetics brain, okay? And what they mean by that is that Matthew looks at the world and his reality in a simultaneous composition, from a scientific approach into morphing it into a spiritual philosophy, never accepting anything that anybody else has necessarily put out there, just in a full spectrum of self-discovery for his own self. And we love people like this, right? Because we love to have these authentic conversations. And Matthew's written a great book. I'm just going to read. I have to slide my glasses on because, yeah, you know how that goes. The book is, of course, The Meaning of Life. So we got to get the book, The Meaning of Life. But the tagline is, when the black dog is barking up the right tree, right? So we're going to have a great conversation. We're going to invite all of you to sit back and relax, because we know that in watching this program, you are discovering your own path into your conscious expansion, into your extraordinary, and hopefully into all of the joy and the healing in your life, and creating a reality for yourself that brings you nothing but joy and bliss. So with that, Matthew, thank you for being here on the show with us today.
And thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, Matthew, I want you to, I always get to play the girl in these interviews, because I'm going to poke and prod you a little bit about your personal life. And
okay.
What has led you into this expansiveness that you have discovered for your own self. And then there's always that next level where you're willing to write a book, inspire others to find their own journey as well, which is another level of serving people. But I want to go back and get some information on your childhood, if you don't mind, Matthew. When did you start thinking the way that you think? Have you always been this kind of, I want to see what's going on, I see there's other things going on? When did that start for you?
Well, I guess I've got a slightly unusual childhood background, because both parents are quite different types of people. My mum's very creative, and her side of the family is very business oriented. And my father was in education, head of science, and his family are all very, very academic, if you like, and head teachers, and sort of, gone to Eton and various public schools and so forth. So I had like a contrast of influence. On the one hand, the creativity, and on the other hand, a very rational mind. So I think that set me on a course where there was almost a conflict, but obviously I wanted to bring that conflict to take advantage of that conflict.
Yeah. Well, of course, I guess that's the polarity, that everybody talks about. The opposites attract. It leads you to wonder, what did your parents have? Obviously their energetic attraction to each other, despite however their minds work. So you got to grow up not only hearing the difference in philosophies in life, but maybe with your own self holding both of those spaces for your own reality as well.
Yeah, I think I probably tended a lot more towards the rational side. I've always challenged it. So when I studied religious education, for example, I obviously felt the essence of the messages, but I also saw a lot of conflicts. So I guess I passed the academic side of things like that by learning through actually the challenge and remembering aspects that I found quite controversial. Similarly with science. I took it for many. I was very strong in science and scored very highly, but I was kind of rote learning, and really until my 30s, I accepted science at face value. And then I went on a round the world trip for 12 months, so I had a lot of time as an entrepreneur to assess different cultures, people, and what the world was about and whatever. But I also took that time out to learn quite deeply about things like evolutionary psychology. And in many ways that effectively implies that we're void of free will and that we're puppets. But I started to look deeper into evolution and something called sexual selection, like the peacock's tail, and started to see there were flaws in the narrative, the mainstream narrative. And I guess because I'm an entrepreneur, where someone says this is the way we've always done it, that isn't really a good enough answer, because if there are better ways of doing it, then, you know, so with that kind of mindset, I was able to look at the various aspects of the mainstream narrative of science and spot flaws, and, you know, and that's basically how I managed to unite spirituality with science, really, I guess.
Right. Well, the theory leads from Julius is that science is late. Spirituality is the launching of what ignites science in their investigation of something. That in a theory, they can be seen as the same thing elongated or expanded from its own self. So when science is the demonstration of a theorized knowing master, it tends to please a humanoid that desires to seek proof of all that they are. And that is the late approach to your knowing, Although, if that is the approach that leads you back into the now, in the access point of authentic thought and emotion, which is where we know ourselves as the all, then we of course applaud and include every road, every avenue that leads you back to your own self. So at what point, Master, do you feel that you have a thorough knowing of all that you are thus far on your journey in this moment?
I think it became apparent. It was like a giant jigsaw puzzle. I guess even when I was halfway through writing the book, it was internalized to a certain degree, but maybe not a full knowing. I think the full knowing has become more recently. It became obvious that the human brain was a filtering system, and that although we gain access to encoded information from the five senses externally, that, well, for one, that means that it's subjective, and obviously even mood can alter that. It also means that everyone is effectively creating their own reality. What people perhaps don't tend to get with that is that there is a kind of subjective reality in terms of like an agreed upon hallucination, because of the fact we are alters of the mind. That is the provision of the context and the information. And I think a lot of people who are against spiritualism will say we don't create our own reality because there is COVID is real, or whatever. And obviously that is true, but if you take someone like a schizophrenic person, there may be 10 people and one of them may be schizophrenic. So everyone's looking at a tree and a person, but this schizophrenic person may see two people. Obviously that's quite profound, because this person they see can talk, they have a personality, they walk, they fit in with a 3-dimension effectively. So to all intents and purposes, it is real to them. As a functioning human being, that isn't useful, because they're not joining in with the agreed upon hallucination. But in effect, that is a reality to them. But obviously, using medical science, they try to suppress that, and it's useful to do so. So that's kind of how I've got to that position.
Yeah, so Master, we support that your human brain does not create thought. It is the receiver of thought, okay? So through vibrational content, the pool of thought or consciousness around you, your brain is a receiver, just like a radio receiver. So this gets really interesting, because this means that you cannot dream something up that isn't somewhere and somehow. So this puts a whole new broader acceptance in what one can perceive to be a possibility, which you can then funnel through your perceptive aspect energy field and create a reality from that thought for yourself. In schizophrenia, we support that people are pulling thoughts from a multiverse of dimensions and timeline variances in those dimensions, okay? And though we do agree that commonly a third-dimensional humanoid being is not doing that in the percentage that collective conscious creative reality that everybody buys into doesn't support that, in schizophrenia we do support that, like you said, that is real. There's nothing that isn't real. There is only the perception of what is real based on what you accept or what your mind is open to. Now, what does this do? We do agree that this makes it a challenge for somebody in a schizophrenic state to funnel their thoughts into an active application into the common denominator of what is accepted in the third dimensional realm. However, if your reality is creating a joyous aspect for yourself, who is to argue your state of being? Who is to argue your state of knowing? Because we will tell you this. There is no two people that experience reality identically. Even if you've got 10 people sitting in a room, we guarantee that none of the 10 of them are experiencing the room identically because it's not designed that way. So you are, or we are, fractals of thought possibility. In our terms, that's the closest of what it comes to being source. And so the variances are fantastic, are they not? At first, this can be frustrating because you want the answer, until you figure out that all of it holds an answer or a truth somewhere, somehow. Does that make you frustrated, or does that make you joyous in the possibility of that?
For me, it's a good thing. I guess one of the frustrations is that in science, they won't accept that because obviously they're measuring what they believe to be an external world and believing heavily in objectivity. I think there is a way around that, actually. One of my friends in Australia is a top psychologist, but is not conventional in the fact that he's written a book about synchronicity. Now, as you well know, a higher vibration tends to increase the synchronicity aspect in life. And this obviously can be assessed in terms of data points. So when the synchronicity increases, some people would just call that coincidence, but when it accelerates. So I believe that is a possible way forward in the unification of science and spirituality.
Yeah. What is wonderful is that nobody is wrong. They can be limited in their perspective. Another can be more expansive in their perspective. But it's really wonderful that there really is nothing wrong other than if you perceive it to be wrong. At some point of consciousness, as you just stated, Master, when your vibrational field is in an extraordinarily high state, there's no time or pause between these truths. So all truth becomes an accepted knowing for you. This is an extraordinary place to be. And humans can reach this state. Now there is an even higher state than that which happens when you are holding material matter in a coagulated formation, because that requires a particular vibration. But your conscious vibration can actually be higher than the physical embodiment, and that's when things get really creative and fun. And like you said, you hit a high enough vibration, and you will then perceive that synchronicity becomes activated. We will tell you that synchronicity always is. It's just that the difference is it's very slow and sluggish in a low vibration, and you're waiting around for it, you're waiting around for it, you're waiting around for it, versus the instantaneous application of it, which can appear to some to be just like magic, right?
Yeah. Also, I'd like to say that there's an effect you may have heard of called the sheep-goat effect. So in psi phenomena, when psychologists assessed it, they found that people who were rejecting the concept of psi phenomena kind of avoided it, and so that wasn't in their reality, which is what you're basically saying. But those who are perceptive to it and accept that it is a possibility do experience and to a degree can perform psi phenomena. The worrying thing for me, if you take that to its extreme, you obviously, even in this modern day, you have people who still believe the Earth is a globe, and you have other extreme people, intelligent people, who believe the Earth is flat. Now, from my perspective, ultimately, the answer is neither, because I believe that in non-local consciousness, and therefore the actual perception of the holographic form, which is given a physical content element, is because of the perception of physicality, which is a synchronization within the brain and how let's call it the pseudo-physical brain, interacts with the so-called out there. So for me, actually, it's academic. But from their perspective out there in this, what we said before was an agreed upon hallucination, we have completely diametrically opposing views. Now, of course, the scientists will say it's absolutely preposterous, the idea of a flat Earth. And quite possibly, to me, that is as well, because, you see sphere objects in terms of through the telescope and whatever. But I'm interested in your views into how extreme this diametrically opposing view can be, where those realities are still maintained, even though they're conflicting.
Yes. So, Master, as we stated before, you cannot think of something that isn't. You cannot think of something that isn't, because your brain does not create thought. It processes thought. So anything that anybody can think of is somewhere, somehow. Now, this is fantastic, but this is what we support in materialistic dimensional components that are physical aspects for you to know thought through the perspective of physicality. And this Earth ship, known as Xtra, has 11 different dimensional formations of a materialized version of herself. And so you, as a physically embodied being, can exist and do exist in 11 different various dimensions of materialistic density per space measurement in order to perceive thought in different ways. And there is a singular dimensional reality in which the Earth ship is flat. It's one-dimensional. Now, you are in a third-dimensional paradigm, so your Earth ship is perceived by you to be a third-dimensional spherical aspect. And this is directly related to the ocular cavity in your eye, which picks up on third-dimensional components. And you literally cannot see things accurately because of your ocular cavity. Now, there are fourth-dimensional perceptions of the Earth ship, 5, 6, 7, and all the way up to 11. So when beings are speaking of what they can see, what they can perceive, we will support. They are tapping into fractaled versions of themselves existing in those dimensions and being able to tap into the information and pull it here and intelligently convey what it is that they know because they are experiencing that. Now, Master, we support that you are there as well. But your focus in your conscious awareness state is the third dimensional paradigm, which is spectacular. All dimensional paradigms are spectacular, and they are never meant to make any other dimension wrong or incorrect in what it knows. So we support there is a flat Earth. Not in the third dimension, there isn't, but in the first dimension there is. Now, if this resonates with you, this gets really fun, doesn't it? Because you will have the opportunity to encounter beings that can supply an extended version of information and truth to you that ultimately the way that your brain works will expand your reality possibilities. Now, we support actually that all sentient beings are the same energy. So there are philosophies that will say that we are all one, and we support that as a truth. Also, in being all possibility, we are the singular component, experiencing the separateness in the variations of thought and realities as well. We actually will tell you that we do not see that the Earth ship is a perfect sphere in the third dimension. You're a little more melon-shaped, actually, and that the photos that you have seen are picking up on the front or the back component of the Earth. And through the camera, it looks a little bit more like a sphere. So we say you're just a little slightly squashed than a perfect sphere in the third dimension. But then you also have to ask yourself, what does that do for you? You know, is your reality based on whether something is flat or round or oblong that you are traversing upon? Through your sensory systems, Master, you know materialized thought to be supporting itself as a version, but your knowing begins with the way something feels internally. And when you blend the two of those, you are walking on this Earth ship, Master Flynn.
Yes, I completely agree with that, and I guess because I've seen science as a signpost to those truths, that's the case for me. So I'm fully aware, for example, that linear time is an illusion from the brain perspective, and therefore any past lives are actually all concurrent. And in fact, my own birth, sickness, aging, and towards death element is every moment is a singular moment, and of course that is in such conflict with how the human brain perceives reality, because it's effectively appears to be an impossibility, because on the one hand you've got a singular moment which would imply nothing can happen, and on the other hand we can quite clearly see a progression with things like entropy or with evolution or just the motion and effects of gravity on or the mass or whatever. So I can see the problem, and does it really matter ultimately, do you think, that you will have people like Professor Richard Dawkins, who sees what we can obviously see is an animated entity which is quite profound and quite clearly displaying it has mind? And in fact, biologists are now starting to do papers that are going to reveal that there's teleology in biology, so it's going to very much conflict with his narrative. But does it really matter that we have someone like Professor Richard Dawkins who is communicating and teaching that spirituality is fake and lazy, in fact, when in fact I would argue that the science has been lazy because it's not actually looking deep into the fundamental understandings.
Right. Yeah, we love all of the variations, and the order that you put things in, Master, is just based on your perspective. And it will always support itself as a truth. Quantum physics supports that, right? Whatever your perspective is, you will project that knowing out into the hologram, and the hologram will always demonstrate back to you what you know. That's why everybody is right or everybody is correct, which is how you get a righteousness attitude spread across humanity, which then becomes the conflict of all the controlling mechanisms on the Earth ship. As you grow in your broad-minded aspect, this will resolve itself. And of course, time is an illusion, because once again, because there's a variance in it and an inconsistency in it based on somebody's perception, you can know that it's just part of the particles that come from your projector in between you and the screen that you're looking at. That's really what all time is. It's a pause, it's a hesitation, it's a contemplation. As your conscious awareness rises and you get more brain activation, time completely dissipates for you. So we are going to support that in the third dimensional reality, most human beings not only have between 3 and 10% of their brain working, but it's the same 3 and 10%. So you all bounce off of each other's frequency vibrational thoughts. That supports your time for you. That's all that supports your time for you. Now, as you expand your brain, even if you get into the 30% usage component, which is where Einstein was, so Einstein was between 25 and 30% brain usage, his time changed for him. That's how he was able to come up with theories of relativity, and he was working on a whole nother theory when he decided to disembody himself. So the more brain activity you get, the more time dissipates, and everything goes back to supporting itself as being in the now, in the concurrency. For most people, that's just a projected theory at this point that they're hoping is true and that they can occasionally tap into for their manifestation process. But other than that, their reality plays themselves out from a morning to lunch to night, to aging, to waiting for things to occur for them. When you raise your consciousness, your brain activates itself. This gets really extraordinary and fun. And all it takes is for anybody to just sit in a space of being open-minded enough for this to possibly be. And you will be amazed at what shows up. Everything physical is an illusion, Master, for we support that an illusion means that it can go away. What is real, Master, is how something feels through the experience of something physical. So although something, they dissipate, the transformation that it created within you is eternal.
Yeah, I wonder actually whether Einstein would have got to where he was going, because of course, I mean, if you look at the two things he changed from the Newton perspective, one being gravity as a force, which Einstein recognized as a bending of space-time, and also Newton obviously believed in absolute time, and Einstein came along and he effectively said that past, present and future are an illusion, albeit a stubborn one, and he created effectively in his mind a block universe. But of course, as you pointed out, there's an even deeper level where the space-time construct itself is an illusion also, in terms of the fact that there is only a singular moment. And I wonder whether because of his genius and the fact that he created space-time, which does model exactly, more accurately, of course, the Newtonian physics is very accurate, but there were errors, and along came Einstein, and his theory was more accurate into how our agreed upon hallucination is the out there perceived physical reality. So for all intents and purposes, his is perfectly accurate, but I wonder, because of the match between the agreed upon hallucination and Einstein's worldview and what is now the general worldview, whether he would have been able to go deep within, as in Buddha, for example, as a first-person experience, he recognized that matter is in fact all illusory. Whether Einstein could have, I think perhaps, I'm not sure whether, I've read letters by him, and there's an indication that he was quite spiritual and he did have deeper understandings beyond. So I guess there were two sides to him again, the genius scientist, but also he was quite a philosopher as well.
Yeah, so Master, of course he was a channel. He was an incredible channel to receive information from, let's just say, higher versions of his own self in the never-ending expandable versions that we all are collectively. What he could see and what he could receive as a thought, he ultimately could not explain. He always had to slow it down to a point of explanation. And Masters, words are old. Words are old. As you get higher and newer and fresher thoughts, you won't be able to describe them, because everything that humans accept as an explanation is old ways, old ways. Communication is slow and sluggish. Eventually, humanity will come back to full intuitiveness, where you literally will be able not only to just tap into thought experience, but to convey thought experience to each other. This works at a rapid pace and allows for further expandability. The more that you command and demand an explanation or a formulation to be written out to explain a reality, you've gotten very sluggish. Other dimensions actually see you this way. They actually see you moving in slow, sluggish, exaggerated motions. No matter how quickly you think you are speaking or conveying or writing or transmuting, even through coding, Master, even through binary coding, which supports a third dimensional reality, that is kindergarten ultimately to when you are able to process thought. Now, the question about Einstein is this. So this gets really interesting. So he was beginning, of course, to experience not only his brain literally activating at a higher, more expandable rate, but the reversing of age within his brain. You know that they cut his brain open, and his brain was that of a 25-year-old man when he died, and they cannot explain that. But what he was experiencing was at just about 50% activity, Master. You can ascend off of this Earth ship. Now, you can make a decision to remain on the Earth ship and experience the third dimension and activate your full brain. But at only about 50%, you can literally think your vibration into such a high rate that you can return to being light, and then you can descend your vibration back down, the ascension and descension process. So the question would be, how long was he going to stick around? He was reaching that bridge of 50% brain activation, and was his intention to ascend and leave at that time? Given his circumstances during the war and the pressure that he was experiencing from Hitler to create the atomic bomb and to weaponize all of his theories and all of his genius, he chose to go. We assure you, Master, that embodied being has returned since that time, and like all sentient beings, you will continue to incarnate yourself into all kinds of timelines and all kinds of realities in order to further your exploration of what you have decided to demonstrate through your thought and your knowing. Perhaps that is you. Perhaps you are on your way, Master, to activating your brain, and the more that you focus on that, the more joyous your experience will become.
Thank you. That's a great compliment. I can sympathise also, of course, with the scientific community, because if you take, for example, 1 + 1 = 2, it's a symbolic thing. I mean, mathematics actually was my background, mathematical sciences and audiology. But I obviously sympathise with the fact that, say, 1 apple + 1 apple in our reality = 2, and therefore symbolically mathematics is represented. Obviously it's represented in incredibly complex ways as well in terms of music and many, many different forms, and so mathematicians quite often are discovering rather than inventing. But the point is that that is a truism, and it's very difficult for someone who is sold solely on the physical realm to recognise that 1 + 1 is part of that agreed upon hallucination, whereby 1 + 1, I call it the quantum realm, but the ultimate realm of infinite possibilities, that of course does not need to be the case. It can literally, you can imagine 1 + 1 and it could morph all sorts of things. I mean, even unicorns, which I shouldn't be saying things like that because it will be condemned instantly by science. I think the beautiful part is and this is why I guess I created the book, is that the scientific arguments and detailed, there are 3 versions of the book. The first 2 are very scientific, but still accessible, possibly just pitched below A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking level, so it's still accessible. But the third one being more about the truths, therefore if you're not interested in rationality and science. But the idea of the initial one is a foundation, because the point being is that people like Professor Richard Dawkins, who is opposed to someone, for example, like Rupert Sheldrake, equally clever guys. Both have done credible experiments, but obviously Rupert Sheldrake, unfortunately, is considered woo-woo, even though quite clearly he knows what the scientific method is and he follows the protocol. Say with Dean Radin, for example, it's quite horrific, really, how they've been marginalised and considered nothing better than snake oil sellers or whatever. So the point of the book is that it is there for people who sit on the fence, because the problem, of course, is that the scientific reductionism has been incredibly useful to us in terms of advancement within the illusion of linear time, in terms of technology, manipulation of matter. So that makes them kings, but at the same time, it's the emperor with no clothes. But it's incredibly hard to actually to assess all the evidence, and things like the linearity of biological form doesn't work the way the scientists see. And you can see that there are clear paradoxes in many different parts of the narrative. All it would take actually is an open mind, even as a very scientific person. But that's asking quite a lot, of course, because many of them have already made their mind up, which is fine, but they've influenced maybe 90% of the globe. So 90% of the globe are looking only at the scientific narrative, which is fine in terms of what science can do, but not fine in terms... Science is only ever, as you hopefully will agree, is a pattern recognition system, and it's absolutely incredible at that. But that's kind of inductive reasoning, and the abductive reasoning that, say, a doctor would use is more interested in the actual cause and effect side of things. And of course, with science, they tend to disclose what is happening and report it and see the patterns and proclaim that as an understanding. Whereas it's never about ultimate cause. And as you said, that's the knowing. But the human brain, in its early development of the evolution, has become so, blinded by, I guess, the narrative of science, that many of these people assume something is woo-woo without actually going and exploring in more detail. And obviously that affects the agreed upon hallucination part of reality in a bad way, in a sense, because you're seeing an increase in depression, you're seeing less contentment, you're seeing perhaps nefarious plans of certain people who have the biological selfish gene aspect, which creates not what we call evil from a higher perspective, but creating a reality that impacts other people's realities in a negative way that doesn't need to be the case. And I guess I wrote the book as a means to try and be part of the catalyst of the shift where there is a change in understanding in that direction.
Wonderful. And in fact, and this is exactly how it expands itself, Master, is when because we will tell you this. The soul, which is the emotional processor of thought, ultimately we will state that you are all thought possibility, which humans cannot grasp, the infinite broad truth of that statement. But the soul cannot be permanently held back, permanently closed down, cannot kill it. You cannot separate it from itself. It can be temporarily manipulated or stifled through limited thought attempts and applications. So currently on this Earthship, there is an energy force that is stifling everybody's ability to truly know the all. It is a truth, whether you accept that statement or not. They are doing it through chemicals, through frequencies, and they're trying to prevent the brain from expanding itself into these broader theories and knowings. They are trying to hold the reptilian brain as the primarily active component, which is the point of resistance. So the altered ego lives in the reptilian brain, Master, which lives in previous, which always lives in the past. It does not live in the now. So if your thoughts are constantly referring to previous, which is what science does, you will not be able to move into the broader space. But as you open your mind and you accept broader truths of the now, this is where the new stuff comes in, or what's perceived to be the new stuff. People like yourself, masters like yourself, who can brilliantly bridge the possibility of those further truths for people, we guarantee you, Master, that people are starving for this information. For what has been proven on this Earthship has mostly been nothing but limitations, controls, manipulation, coercement, and what most human embodied beings have accepted to be a truth, which is a complete lie, and that is death. But as you move into your own inspirational thoughts, Masters, your own spiritual experiences, the things that pull you to be able to write down what you have a knowing of, and knowing is a feeling. It has nothing to do with proof. It has nothing to do with evidence. It is the feeling of what a thought is for you. It is those like you, Master, that we consider to be the light workers, the embodied beings of expandable knowing that have decided to come to this earth and assist those that have fallen asleep. But here's the question. In doing this time around for you, does it bring you joy? Do not buy into the frustration of people who command proof about your theories. Love them, honor them, and with joy, Master, find ways to express your truth, and more ways, and more ways. And then you sit in the category not only of genius, but brilliance, Master. That is illuminated light attached to thought. And it is so brilliant, it is blinding. And that is the category that we put you into.
Thank you again. I want to say something a little controversial now in terms of the fact that the beautiful spirit that is Eckhart Tolle and his teachings that are wonderful and his presentism and the understanding of the power of now, the one thing that seems missing from that equation is that he seems to underestimate the power of intent. So he will say, quite correctly, of course, that it is insanity to fight against the isness. So whatever presents, put the welcome mat out and accept it, because obviously it's insane to fight against the isness of what appears to be reality. He does in fact say that your life is real and life circumstances are not. So there's an acknowledgement there. But on your previous show, you've talked obviously about the manifestation based on intent. Even though God's delays do not mean God's denials, therefore the intent may not manifest immediately. And also there are underlying belief differences between what perhaps the higher consciousness element has as a belief, or let's call it subconscious. And so you may say, I wish to have a Ferrari and I will get a Ferrari, but if you have subconscious blocks that say that money is evil, then potentially you may not end with that Ferrari, not because the system itself is at fault, but because there are underlying reasons why you don't manifest. So with Eckhart's teachings of the power of now, which obviously is very solid in terms of don't accept the past as a reality or the future as a reality, take it seriously but not literally, there is almost a passive acceptance in those teachings rather than the fact that within that power of now, which there only ever is, the human being is able to have a serious influence on the agreed upon hallucination, and therefore future, as we'll call it in the illusion of linear time, can be influenced. Now that's not to say that for something horrific like in the 9/11 situation, there were, in our perceived reality, there were excess of 2,000 people killed or whatever, and obviously some of those people would be high advocates of, say, the law of attraction. So someone who's cynical might say, well, why did they die, therefore? But obviously there's much deeper reasons for all that kind of thing. So in my view, at least, I don't know if you concur, but the missing part of that is the fact that we cannot maybe change what we perceive if we're locked in on the 3D realm, agreed upon hallucination, but we can very, very heavily influence our own integration and the reality that appears within that. And so by passively just accepting what comes, which may be something as horrific as being a wife beating or systematically going with people that are beaters in your life. So when you finish with one, you move on to the next, which is kind of like a reverse law of attraction, in that the mind is manifesting in a negative way. So these teachings, whilst are superior to any other in the fact that obviously it's good not to focus on the now or the past or the future, does appear to miss the impact of intent, if that makes sense.
So, Master, we support that the component is the acceptance. Absolute knowing is what you accept, and what you accept becomes. That's it. not belief. Belief is conjectural to knowing. It's on its way. You're trying to hope that something is. And then when it shows up, you have a tendency to accept it. But what you do not realize, Master, is that you have missed that you accepted it first and then it showed up. Humans do not recognize what full acceptance feels like until after they have accepted something. So the key component to the moment is of now that makes everything that you can think and perceive instantaneous for your reality, Master, is to master the action of knowing. That is full acceptance and full absolute. That's the tag. That's the tag. So when Masters talk about the now, it is nearly impossible for embodied beings to accept that concept because they all live in the previous. Your whole reality is what you know. And you tend to know afterwards what has showed up, and you hold that as your knowing. You don't go into a broader knowing. You don't go into a new possibility unless you do. Now, those that master manifestation know this concept to be true, and they have turned their spiritual or conscious journey into what we call precision awareness of what they feel. Because your knowing and your acceptance changes. It expands itself. But if you are in precision action awareness of all of your thoughts and your feelings, you will have no disruption in your reality from what you dream of to what becomes. Now, this is the high conscious teachings of absolute knowing that lives in a high conscious state. Anything third dimensional is lower frequency from that, Master, because in the creative process, you slow thought down into a materialistic form. You go through 7 levels or stages of creativity, and you as a third dimensional being are in the 7th stage or the first stage, depending on where you're looking at that from ascension or descension. And you've got to get your thoughts all the way up higher than light or sound. And just know that if you think it, it is. It's a feeling, Master, and that feeling is the rocket fuel that turns that thought into an actualized version of itself. It's fun, but it takes intention, like you said, is the desire and the fortitude to move into that truth. Why? Because it becomes so masterful for you. Well, Master, in coming out of this conversation for now, we would love to allow you to speak to the audience of your book, where they can find your book, and know that these conversations continue within your book for the viewer and the reader. Can you tell them how to find you, please? Our apologies, we're having some technical difficulty with finishing up the conversation with Matthew, so I'm going to reiterate Matthew's book, which is The Meaning of Life, When the Black Dog is Barking Up the Right Tree.
Thanks again, Expand with Julie. This is a great experience. And my new book's out, and it's The Meaning of Life, When the Black Dog is Barking Up the Right Tree. And to check out more details, go to www.mhforrest, that's FORREST.com, or www.itza.global. Thanks again.
We want to thank all of you for viewing this program, and always inviting you to this experience of conversations that we are able to have and that we're honored to have with guests like Matthew. We are sending blessings and love and joy your way in every way for your life, and want to thank you for being here with us today. I'm your host, Casey Wallace.